The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in European memory. Thick snow blanketed the Ardennes forest, a region of Belgium that had been quiet for months, so quiet that Allied commanders considered it a rest sector for battle-weary troops. But beneath the frozen stillness, the Germans were preparing a last, desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. Adolf Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, had devised Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a massive armored offensive designed to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, German artillery shattered the silence, signaling the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, surged forward along a weakly defended 85-mile front. Their assault, aimed at exploiting gaps in the American lines, caught the Allies off guard. In the midst of this chaos, a small but determined American unit found itself at the epicenter of the German onslaught, Team Desobry. Led by Major William Desobry, this ad hoc unit consisted of elements from the 10th Armored Division, along with scattered infantry and reconnaissance units. Their orders were simple, yet daunting. Hold the town of Noville, a critical crossroads just north of Bastogne, for as long as possible. The defense of Bastogne itself depended on preventing German forces from gaining momentum in the surrounding villages, and Noville was a key position that could not be allowed to fall. As the German advance thundered toward Noville, Desobry and his men dug in. The American force, numbering fewer than 500 men and supported by a handful of M4 Sherman tanks, faced the full fury of the German 2nd Panzer Division. By the morning of December 19th, waves of German armor and infantry swarmed toward their position. The Americans responded with everything they had. Sherman tanks fired point-blank at advancing Panzer V's and Tiger tanks, while bazooka teams waited in the shadows, striking at vulnerable points in the enemy formations. Despite the overwhelming odds, Team Desobry fought with a ferocity that stunned the Germans. M1 Garand rifles cracked through the bitter cold, machine guns chattered from hastily dug foxholes, and artillery shells rained down on the advancing enemy. German tanks burned in the snow, their hulks becoming makeshift barricades as the battle raged. The defenders knew there was no retreat. Their only options were to hold or be annihilated. As the sun set over the frozen battlefield, the Germans redoubled their efforts. Mortar rounds pounded Noville, collapsing buildings and setting others ablaze. The Americans, running low on ammunition and supplies, fought on. Desobry himself was wounded in the battle, but refused to leave his command. The stubborn resistance of his men delayed the German advance for crucial hours, allowing reinforcements to prepare Bastogne's defenses. By December 20th, however, it was clear that Team Desobry could not hold Noville any longer. Encircled and outnumbered, they received orders to withdraw to Bastogne. The retreat was as perilous as the defense. German forces pressed hard, forcing the Americans to fight their way out under relentless fire. Yet against all odds, the remnants of Team Desobry made it back to Bastogne, where they joined the famed 101st Airborne Division in the legendary defense of the city. Their stand at Noville had not been in vain. The delay they inflicted on the Germans bought Bastogne precious time, preventing the enemy from overwhelming the town before the arrival of General Patton's Third Army. Team Desobry's defiance became one of the defining moments of the Battle of the Bulge, a testament to the grit and determination of American soldiers in the face of impossible odds. Though their numbers were small, their impact was immense. The battle for Noville was a microcosm of the entire Ardennes campaign, a desperate, brutal struggle against a relentless foe. In the end, the German offensive failed, and Hitler's dream of reversing the war's outcome collapsed in the snowy fields of Belgium. But it was battles like Noville, where a few hundred men refused to break, that ensured the final victory of the Allies in Europe. The attack began in the early hours of December 16, 1944, under the cover of dense fog that grounded Allied reconnaissance planes. Nearly 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, surged forward against thinly held American positions. The initial assault was devastating. Whole regiments were overrun, communication lines were severed, and confusion spread as reports of enemy breakthroughs flooded Allied headquarters. The offensive, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, was Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied lines, encircle key positions, and force a negotiated peace on Germany's terms. In the chaos of the initial attacks, American forces scrambled to form a coherent defense. The German spearheads crashed through the Ardennes forest, where defenses were weak and undermanned. The 8th Corps, stretched thin across an 85-mile front, struggled to mount an organized resistance. Pockets of American units fought desperately to slow the advance, but German panzer divisions, spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Division, drove forward relentlessly. Among the first American units thrust into the path of this overwhelming assault was Combat Command B, CCB, of the 10th Armored Division, led by Major William R. Desobry. His force, soon to be known simply as Team Desobry, was a mixed unit of tanks, armored infantry, and tank destroyers, a mobile strike force designed for rapid response. Their mission quickly became one of the most critical delaying actions of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Ordered to defend Noville, a key village northeast of Bastogne, Desobry's men moved into position as the German offensive gained momentum. By December 18th, the enemy was closing in. Team Desobry's defensive line was thin, just a few hundred soldiers with Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers, against an advancing German force that outnumbered them 10-1. The 2nd Panzer Division, reinforced by elements of the Panzer Division, sought to capture Noville as part of their push toward Bastogne, a vital crossroads that the Germans hoped to take before the Americans could fortify it. As dawn broke on December 19th, German artillery thundered through the mist, hammering Noville with relentless shelling. Team Desobry braced for impact as the 1st Panzers and infantry units emerged from the tree line, advancing across the open fields. The Americans held their fire until the enemy was within range, then unleashed a devastating barrage. Sherman tanks fired armor-piercing shells, knocking out leading Panzer by foes. M10 tank destroyers positioned on the flanks ambushed heavier Tiger tanks, striking at their weaker side armor. Bazooka teams lay hidden in the rubble, waiting for the moment to fire at advancing German armor. The first German wave faltered under the weight of this resistance, but more followed. For hours, Noville became a killing ground, with American soldiers battling wave after wave of German attacks. Machine gun fire raked the streets, and rifle squads fought from house to house as enemy infantry pushed closer. The defenders held firm, knowing that retreat meant the fall of Bastogne. Despite being wounded, Major Desobry refused to leave the battlefield. His leadership inspired his men, who repelled each German assault with unwavering determination. The streets of Noville ran red with blood, burning tanks littered the landscape, and the wreckage of German and American vehicles marked the ferocity of the battle. By December 20th, however, the pressure was unbearable. Ammunition was running low, casualties mounted, and German forces began encircling the town. The decision was made. Team Desobry would withdraw under the cover of darkness. In a fighting retreat, the survivors broke through German lines and reached Bastogne, where they joined the 101st Airborne Division in what would become the legendary Siege of Bastogne. Their stand at Noville was not in vain. By delaying the Germans for crucial hours, Team Desobry prevented the enemy from storming Bastogne before reinforcements could arrive. Their sacrifice helped shape the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, ensuring that the German advance stalled before it could achieve its objectives. The battle for Noville was just one chapter in the larger struggle, but it symbolized the unbreakable spirit of American forces in World War II. In the end, Hitler's grand offensive failed, and the Ardennes became the graveyard of the last German hope for victory in the West. Team Desobry's stand remains one of the great acts of heroism and defiance in the history of armored warfare. By December 18, 1944, the German spearhead was pushing forward with relentless force. Leading the charge was the 2nd Panzer Division, a battle-hardened unit that had once terrorized Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. Now, it was advancing toward Bastogne, a strategic crossroads town whose capture would give the Germans control over a vital road network. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank of the German Ardennes Offensive could surge forward, cutting deep into Allied lines and potentially turning the tide of the war. The U.S. High Command, recognizing the grave threat, rushed the 101st Airborne Division toward Bastogne. These elite paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, were tough, disciplined, and willing to fight. But they needed time to fortify their defenses. Bastogne's survival depended on delaying the German advance, and someone had to stand in the way. That responsibility fell to a small but determined force, Team Desobry. At 0300 hours on December 19th, under the cover of darkness and bitter winter winds, Major William Desobry and his men rolled into Noville, a small village just 4 miles north of Bastogne. The town was little more than a cluster of houses and farms, but it sat on high ground, a natural defensive position that overlooked the roads leading toward Bastogne. Desobry immediately recognized its significance. If the Germans wanted to reach Bastogne, they would have to take Noville first. The problem was that Team Desobry was badly outnumbered and outgunned. His force consisted of 15 M4 Sherman tanks, reliable but inferior to the German Panthers and Tigers, which had thicker armor and more powerful 75mm and 88mm guns. A single company of armored infantry, dismounted and forced to spread thinly across defensive positions. A handful of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, incredibly fast but lightly armored, relying on speed rather than protection to engage enemy armor. No heavy artillery support, meaning they would have to rely on direct firepower and whatever indirect support they could manage with their mortars and machine guns. Against them, the 2nd Panzer Division was bearing down with at least 30 tanks, including Panthers, Panzer Division, and possibly even King Tigers, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. Worse still, the weather was turning against the Americans. A thick, freezing fog smothered the battlefield, reducing visibility and grounding Allied air support, which had been crucial in stopping German armor throughout the war. Now, there would be no P-47 Thunderbolts swooping in to strafe enemy columns. Team Desobry was completely on its own. As dawn broke over Noville, the rumble of German tanks grew louder. The battle was about to begin, and Desobry's men, cold, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, prepared to make their stand against the overwhelming firepower of Hitler's final, desperate offensive. As dawn broke on December 19, 1944, a thick winter fog clung to the fields around Noville, muffling the sounds of engines and distant gunfire. The Germans had spent the early morning probing the town's outskirts with reconnaissance units, searching for weaknesses in the American defenses. From their positions on high ground, Team Desobry watched in silence, holding their fire. Then, at 0800 hours, the full force of the German attack began. Out of the dense fog, a column of Panther tanks emerged, their long-barreled 75mm guns scanning for targets. The American tank crews, positioned behind shattered buildings and in defilade, held their nerve, waiting for the enemy to close within 500 yards before firing. The first shot rang out. A M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, known for its speed and deadly accuracy, scored a direct hit on a Panther's flank. Flames erupted from the wreckage as the German tank exploded in a fireball, but the rest of the column kept advancing. The battle turned into a brutal duel. The Shermans, knowing they were outgunned, fired and maneuvered desperately, trying to hit weak points on the approaching German armor. A single Panther round could penetrate a Sherman at almost any range, while the American 75mm shells struggled against the Panther's thick frontal armor. One by one, American tanks were knocked out, but they did not go down without a fight. Bazooka teams, hidden in buildings and alleyways, rushed into the chaos, waiting until German tanks passed before firing point-blank into their engines. The Panther's thick frontal armor was nearly impervious, but a well-placed shot to the sides or rear could cripple them. By midday, the burning wrecks of 6 German tanks littered the battlefield. The German advance had slowed, but it had not stopped. Their infantry pushed forward, skirmishing in the snowy fields and tree lines, trying to outflank Noville from the east and south. Desobry realized his position was in danger of being encircled. If the Germans succeeded, Noville and Bastogne itself could fall. With his force on the brink of being overrun, Desobry radioed for reinforcements. Against all odds, elements of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, arrived in the late afternoon, bringing much-needed rifle support. The paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, immediately dug in, reinforcing the town's weakest sectors and setting up deadly kill zones for the next wave of attackers. Is the night attack, Desobry wounded. As darkness settled over Noville, the battlefield grew eerily quiet. The Germans, having suffered heavier losses than expected, changed their tactics. Instead of another frontal assault, they infiltrated the town under cover of the fog. At 2200 hours, German infantry, supported by Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns, crept into Noville's northern edge, using the ruins and smoke as cover. The silence shattered as automatic weapons erupted in the streets. The battle descended into chaos. Americans fired from second-story windows, while German squads moved through alleys, throwing grenades into foxholes and clearing houses room by room. The snow-covered ground, once pristine, turned into a deadly maze of burning wreckage, shattered walls, and lifeless bodies. In the center of town, Major Desobry remained in a half-destroyed farmhouse, using it as his command post. As he coordinated the defense, a mortar shell exploded nearby, sending shrapnel tearing into his body. Bleeding heavily, he refused evacuation, instead gritting his teeth and continuing to lead as his men fought desperately to hold their ground. The fighting raged through the night. At one point, a German machine gun nest pinned down an entire American platoon, forcing them to take cover behind the rubble of a collapsed barn. With no way to advance, the situation seemed hopeless until a damaged Sherman tank lurched forward, its armor riddled with holes from earlier battles. The tank crew, seeing the danger, drove straight into the enemy position, ramming the machine gun nest into a ruined building. The entire structure collapsed, crushing the German gunners beneath tons of debris. By dawn, the Americans still held Noville, but barely. The town was reduced to ruins, its streets littered with the wreckage of tanks and shattered buildings. Smoke and fog mixed in the cold morning air, turning the battlefield into a nightmarish scene of destruction. Desobry, gravely wounded, was finally evacuated. But his leadership and defiance had bought the time Bastogne needed. As the sun rose, the exhausted defenders braced for another day of battle, knowing that the German assault was far from over. By December 20th, 1944, the situation in Noville had become untenable. German forces had encircled the town from 3 sides, cutting off all but a single tenuous escape route toward Bastogne. The relentless artillery barrage that had begun the previous day had now reduced much of Noville to smoldering ruins. Buildings that once served as defensive strongholds were now mere skeletons of shattered stone and burning timbers. Smoke mixed with the freezing air, creating a suffocating haze through which the wounded cried out for help. Ammunition was nearly gone. The last operational Shermans had only a handful of shells left, their crews knowing each shot had to count. American machine gunners rationed their remaining belts, only firing when absolutely necessary. Medical supplies had been exhausted, and wounded men lay in the ruins, wrapped in bloody bandages, unable to receive more than the most basic care. Major Desobry, who had fought through the night despite his grievous wounds, was now barely conscious, his uniform stained with blood and dirt. He had refused evacuation for as long as possible, but by midday, his strength finally failed him. His men, determined not to leave him behind, carried him out of the command post on a makeshift stretcher. With Desobry unable to continue, command fell to Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Laprade, a battle-hardened leader, immediately saw the grim reality. Noville could not hold. The Germans, determined to crush the last remnants of resistance, had begun bringing up even heavier armor, including King Tiger tanks, whose massive 88mm guns could tear through American positions with horrifying ease. German infantry, bolstered by fresh reserves, began their final push into the town, using flamethrowers and grenades to clear out the remaining defenders. Then, at 1500 hours, the radio crackled to life with the long-awaited order from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the commander of the 101 St. Airborne Division in Bastogne. The message was short and direct: fall back to Bastogne. There would be no reinforcement, no miracle relief. The defenders of Noville had to break out on their own. The fighting withdrawal, a desperate gamble. Laprade knew retreat under such conditions was almost suicidal. The only remaining road south was riddled with German machine gun nests and covered by enemy artillery. If the withdrawal was not executed with perfect coordination, the entire force could be annihilated. Every available Sherman tank and Hellcat destroyer was ordered into position to provide covering fire. They were instructed to fight until they ran out of ammunition, then withdraw only if they could. Infantrymen, many of them limping from injuries or frostbite, prepared for a last-ditch breakout. The first wave of retreating troops made their move just before 1600 hours, sprinting from cover and using the wreckage-strewn streets as partial concealment. Immediately, German machine guns opened up, sending rounds snapping through the freezing air. A paratrooper was cut down mid-stride, his body tumbling into the snow. Another group barely made it across the road before a German mortar round landed directly in their path, blasting them apart. The tanks fired relentlessly, slowing the German pursuit. A single Sherman, hit twice in the turret, refused to withdraw until its gunner fired his last shell into an approaching Panzer IV, destroying it at point-blank range. Only then did the crew abandon the burning tank and escape on foot. Meanwhile, a platoon of paratroopers, led by Lieutenant Robert Booth, found themselves cut off when a German unit flanked their position. Facing certain capture or death, Booth ordered his men to fix bayonets. In one final charge, they stormed through the enemy line, fighting hand-to-hand with German grenadiers. Against all odds, they broke through and rejoined the retreating force. The last stand at the outskirts. As the last of the American forces pulled out, a handful of volunteers remained behind, a mix of tankers, paratroopers, and armored infantrymen, tasked with delaying the Germans for as long as possible. A lone Hellcat destroyer positioned on the high ground east of Noville became the final roadblock. Its crew of 5 knew they were already dead, but they made their last stand count. From their vantage point, they destroyed 2 more German tanks, delaying the advance by another precious 15 minutes. When a Panther finally flanked them, their Hellcat erupted into flames, its turret blown clean off. By nightfall, the survivors of Team Desobry and the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had reached the outer perimeter of Bastogne. They had lost more than half their men, but they had held Noville for 3 critical days, time that had allowed Bastogne to be fully fortified. The aftermath. A delay that changed history. The significance of Team Desobry's stand at Noville became clear in the days that followed. The 101st Airborne, now dug in at Bastogne, would withstand the full fury of the German siege of Bastogne, throwing off the entire timetable of the Battle of the Bulge. When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, Allied aircraft bombed German supply lines mercilessly, depriving the Wehrmacht of the fuel and reinforcements needed to continue their offensive. On December 26, 1944, General Patton's Third Army broke through and relieved Bastogne, dealing a fatal blow to Hitler's last great offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge, which had once threatened to split the Allied front, collapsed into a disastrous retreat for the Germans. Major William Desobry, though severely wounded, survived. He was later awarded the Silver Star for his gallantry and leadership. Laprade, however, did not live to see the victory. He was killed in action at Bastogne just days later. The legacy of Team Desobry. Today, memorials in Noville and Bastogne stand in honor of the men who held the line in those crucial days. Surviving veterans of Team Desobry often recalled the brutal cold, the deafening roar of tank battles, and the friendships forged in fire. Many never spoke of their actions with bravado, but history remembers them as heroes. The battle for Noville was more than a military engagement. It was a defining moment of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. Against overwhelming odds, these men stood their ground. They bought 3 days at the cost of their blood and lives, 3 days that may have saved Bastogne, and in doing so, helped turn the tide of World War II.